let's talk about how you analyze tone. So to start, basically, tone is the attitude of the speaker. So when we're talking nonfiction, that usually means the author, the writer. If we're talking in fiction, that means the narrator. So tone is actually part of narrative perspective in that regard. So what I wanted to show you today is kind of my process of how I analyze tone and pick out tones in different pieces, because I think that can be one of the more challenging aspects of literary and textual analysis, rhetorical analysis. But the good thing about tone is that it can be analyzed in really any sort of text. So let's start with my process. When I read a section of something, or if I'm reading a text and it comes down to determining what tone I'm looking for, I start with very basic terms. So there are basically 5 categories of emotions, right? And I think the best way to kind of illustrate those categories, is to refer to the movie Inside Out. Now, if you haven't seen Inside Out, 5 characters represent 5 different emotions. So on this screen right here, we have sadness, who is the one in blue. I don't know why it selected that. Blue. There's fear, who's in purple. Okay, sorry, I'm trying to make it unselect and it's not working. Let's use this one. Fear is in purple, anger is in red, joy is in yellow, blue is sadness, and green is disgust. If you think of those 5 characters, they're selected for a reason, because all of the emotions that we feel kind of align into one of those categories, or a mixture of a few of those categories, okay? So that said, the categories that I'm going to refer to are happy, sad, mad, afraid, and disgusted. So now, if I was talking in terms of tone, most of these would not be appropriate. It's not appropriate to say that a passage, the tone is happy, okay? Then we need to kind of branch into subwords and subcategories. So if you look on Schoology, there's a document that's called Tone Words, and it has them already kind of broken up by these to kind of help you and narrow things down. But the real thing with guys, when it comes to vocabulary, when it comes to tone, it's really a vocab game, unfortunately. And so, if this is something that really resonates with you, or that you really want to use in your own analysis, then take some time, learn a few of those tone words. The bottom line is, being good at identifying tone means you're good at identifying emotion, which is not, so to speak, a very easy thing. So in my process, like I said, is I start with these 5 categories. So I read through a passage and I think, okay, well, is the narrative perspective happy? Is it sad? Is it mad? Is it afraid? Is it disgusted? Then within those, there's definitely a range. So if we're talking about sadness, for example, there's a lot of different words that can be attributed to sadness, because there's a lot of different types of sadness. For example, bummed or disappointed could be tone words that are associated with sad. Whereas the word morose, if you've ever heard that one or seen Dead Poets Society, if you're saying you're morose, it means you are overwhelmed by sadness, okay? And when we're talking in a text, we need to specify not just that the speaker's tone is sad, but how sad is it, okay? Because there's other words, devastated would be a very strong word to describe sadness. I'm trying to think of other ones. Glum or gloomy, right? Those are, it's not as heavy as devastated or morose or things like that, but it's definitely a form of sadness, and it's probably a little bit more sad than to say I'm disappointed or to say that I'm bummed, right? And then you could say things like, you could say they're overcome, meaning that they're overcome with sadness. The tone could also be, I'm trying to think of one that fits in that range again. Disappointed. Point of view to use it. I'm having a lot of trouble thinking of words today. Aggrieved is another word that kind of falls into that middle range of sadness too. Like I said, looking at those words, morose, aggrieved, glum, you're probably like, I don't even know what that word means, but that's where I'm saying that tone is really kind of a vocabulary game. So really, even within this branch of sadness, right, it's about being able to pick out a few words within that category that show the range. Because if you can kind of get closer, right, it's better than just saying they're sad. Because if you say the tone of the speaker or the tone of the narrator is sad, that's an incomplete analysis. Okay? So let's look at an example. So what I have pulled up here is this is an article written by Mark Twain, okay? And it's written in narrative style, so that means that Mark Twain is not the speaker in this situation. The narrator is the speaker. So what I do as I'm reading to identify tone is I just read for an overall impression first, and then I go back and break it up. Because the thing about reading for tone, reading for rhetorical choices even, reading for appeals, is you have to have that sense of the big picture before you can go back and break it up. So that's really an annotation strategy that I would recommend. It works for me. Some people need to annotate as they go to kind of keep engaged with the text. That's fine too. For me, I like to get a big picture and then go back into it. So that's how I'm going to show you. So what I'm going to do, like I said, is I'm just going to read through to get an impression, and then I'm going to go back and break it up into chunks or different pieces that show different tones, okay? So let's read. I'm going to start right here. I have pretty much made up my mind to run for president. What the country wants is a candidate who cannot be injured by investigation of his past history, so that the enemies of the party will be unable to rake up anything against him that nobody ever heard of before. If you know the worst about a candidate to begin with, every attempt to spring things on him will be checkmated. Now I'm going to enter the field with an open record. I'm going to open up in advance to all the wickedness I have done, and if any congressional committee is disposed to prowl about my biography in the hopes of discovering any dark and deadly deed that I have secreted, why, let it prowl. In the first place, I admit that I treated a rheumatic grandfather of mine in the winter of 1850. He was old and inexpert in climbing trees, but with the heartless brutality that is characteristic of me, I ran him out of the front door in his nightshirt at the point of a shotgun, and caused him to bowl up a maple tree, where he remained all night, while I emptied shot into his legs. I did this because he snored. I will do it again if I ever have another grandfather. I am as inhuman now as I was in 1850. I candidly acknowledge that I ran away at the Battle of Gettysburg. My friends have tried to smooth over this fact by asserting that I did so for the purpose of imitating Washington, who went into the woods of Valley Forge for the purpose of saying his prayers. It was a miserable subterfuge. I struck out in a straight line to the Tropic of Cancer because I was scared. I wanted my country saved, but I preferred to have somebody else save it. I entertain that preference yet. If the bubble reputation can be obtained only at the cannon's mouth, I am willing to go there for it, provided the cannon is empty. If it is loaded, my immortal and inflexible purpose is to get over the fence and go home. My invariable practice in war has been to bring out of every fight 2/3 more men than when I went in. This seems to be a Napoleonic in its grandeur. My financial views are of a most decided character, but they are not simply, perhaps, to increase my popularity with the advocates of inflation. I do not insist upon the special supremacy of rag money or hard money. The great fundamental principle of my life is to take any kind I can get. The rumor that I buried a dead aunt under my grapevine was correct. The vine needed fertilizing, my aunt had to be buried, and I dedicated her to this high purpose. Does that unfit me for the presidency? The Constitution of our country does not say so. No other citizen was ever considered unworthy of this office because he enriched his grapevines with his dead relatives. Why should I be selected as the first victim of an absurd prejudice? I admit also that I am not a friend of the poor man. I regard the poor man in his present condition as so much wasted raw material. Cut up and properly canned, he might be made useful to fatten the natives of the Cannibal Islands and to improve our export trade with that region. I shall recommend legislation upon the subject in my first message. My campaign cry will be, desiccate the poor working man, stuff him into sausages. These are about the worst parts of my record. On them I come before the country. If my country doesn't want me, I'll go back again. But I recommend myself as a safe man, a man who starts with the basis of total depravity and proposes to be fiendish to the last. Okay, first things first, I hope you picked up on that this is a very satirical passage, kind of poking fun at, at political campaigning and the way that political figures or politicians position themselves to be perfect. And this is obviously doing the direct opposite, saying that he ran his grandfather up a tree and shot at him, that he ran away from battle in Gettysburg because he was scared, that he's greedy and will take whatever money he can get, that he buried his dead aunt in his backyard, and that he has no sympathy for the poor person. So what these things are really doing is kind of highlighting the exact contradiction of the things we look for in presidential candidates. So when we're talking about tone with this one, I think my biggest sections or passages kind of fall like this. The first paragraph and the last paragraph kind of seem to frame this central argument, and that's also how I would describe the tone being split up. Because in the beginning, I would say his tone is nonchalant. Nonchalant, lackadaisical, unfazed are all words that could be used to describe this tone. Now, where do I see that in the passage? Right away, this diction or this word choice of pretty much is very, it's nonchalant because it's saying that they've kind of come to the decision of running for president without much pomp and circumstance. They're just like, I pretty much decided I want to be president, right? So that's, it's a very straightforward or, I'm trying to think of a word, unimposing, that's the word. Unimposing way of announcing something like a presidential candidacy, which is contradictory to the norm in that we know if someone says they're running for president, they don't usually say, well, I'm pretty much going to run for president, okay? So if I was going to analyze the use of nonchalant tone in this section, I would definitely refer to that diction, okay? The next section, there are other things too. For example, when it says, just let it prowl, that expression at the end, or that detail, that syntax with the hyphenate, where he's kind of saying that, like, if people go about looking up my bad history, go ahead, let them, right? It's kind of apathetic. And again, I would talk about syntax in this case because it's the hyphenate and this little added phrase that kind of shows the apathy. So those are two different details or two different elements that I could pick out to analyze the use of nonchalant tone in the speaker or the narrator right there. The next section, I think the best way to describe it is that it's a very matter-of-fact tone. Matter-of-fact tone is often used with satirical passages because the point is to sound really frank and blunt as they're kind of going through things that are actually horrific and actually awful, right? But if they kind of use that matter-of-fact, straight-to-the-point tone, that gives us or allows us to kind of see the humor in that contradiction of being so matter-of-fact about really horrible things. So in that case, for this one, there are the details, right, that we would pick to kind of talk about that contrast, because let's talk about two things. First of all, let's talk about how we know it's matter-of-fact. So for example, again, this structure, or this opening phrase, in the first place, is very formal, right? Very typical essay writing, like when you say first, second, third. Okay, so that's a very matter-of-fact way of developing an essay. I could talk about that in saying it's matter-of-fact. Another one would be like right here where he says, in response to why he shot his grandfather, he just says, I did it because he snored. That's a really frank response. And when I say frank, blunt, matter of fact, right, it's a frank response to his actions. And really, if we look at the syntax throughout, there's multiple short sentences like that. So there's this one. Actually, I'm going to switch to a highlighter so we can see better. There's this one. It was a miserable subterfuge. Trying to find more. I admit that also I have no friend to the poor man. So there's kind of a use of syntactically short sentences. And short, frank, simple sentences are often a way of building that matter-of-fact tone because it's not flowery, it's not embellishing. So that's another way we could talk about syntax and how those short sentences are creating a matter-of-fact tone. And then another thing is if we look down here, the writer starts to use rhetorical questioning. And if you notice with these questions, he's asking things that like the response should be obvious to. For example, he talks about burying his aunt under the grapevine, and then he says, does that make me unfit for president? As a reader, our natural reaction would be, yes, that does make you unfit to be president. That's where that irony falls in, okay? And then later he says, why should I be selected as the first victim of an absurd prejudice? Again, referring to how if people hold it against him that his aunt is buried in his backyard, it would be a rare prejudice, where again, we see the reality of that. So that use of rhetorical questioning could also highlight how he's being matter-of-fact as well. And then the last thing that I'd point out, the last section is where it says, these are about the worst parts of my record. On them I come before my country. If my country don't want me, I will go back again. But I recommend myself as a safe man, a man who starts from the basis of total depravity and proposes to be fiendish to the last. So there's quite a few things happening here. But I would say it's actually returning to that nonchalant tone that it started with. And the reason being is this sentence right here in particular. There's a few things. But it says, if my country don't want me, I will go back again. That is syntax because it's using if-then structure. But what makes it nonchalant is saying that like he's basically arguing that he would be unfazed if he didn't get the presidency, which as we know, if someone is running for president, they do really, truly want the presidency. So that said, if I was to analyze this as a prose passage or as a rhetorical analysis, I could talk about a few things. I could talk about how this use of a matter-of-fact tone here creates humor in that middle section where he's talking about these different funny details. I could also talk about how it begins and ends with that nonchalant tone that kind of contradicts what we expect from presidential candidates. So those are different kind of approaches I could take about tone. And in my next portion, I'm going to show you how I would actually write an analysis for this.